in as they come in.
Great. Well, thank you very much to the Centre for Women's Development Studies for the invitation to come and speak on this topic today. I remember my first trip to India and coming to stay in New Delhi and actually visiting the centre and your extensive library way back in 2011, and also reading some of your wonderful research papers, including work by Mary John. So it's really a pleasure and a privilege to be back, to be joining the centre again in this capacity and sharing some of my work with you today. I am ready for you to start the PowerPoint presentation if someone wants to just load that quickly.
Annie, can I just make the opening remarks before you go on with the PowerPoint presentation?
Sure.
So I, on behalf of CWDS, a very warm welcome to you, Annie. Thank you for joining us all the way from South Africa. We are very happy to have you. And before I go on to give her the floor, I just like to introduce her. She's a historian and researcher with an interest in gender, activism, and identity in the Global South, and how practices of history can be harnessed to transform society. She has published on feminism and development in India and South Africa, labor activism, and the informal economy, as well as traditional health practitioners. Her book, entitled Debating Women's Citizenship in India, 1930 to 1960, published by Bloomsbury in 2019, explores a variety of ways that citizenship was conceptualized at the intersection of nationalist and feminist politics at key moments in the history of Indian democracy. Today, she's going to give a talk based on her research, and the title of her talk today is Reflections on Indian Independence and Nation Building through the lives of her first generation of parliamentary/political women. So a very warm welcome to you again, Annie. And I think that today's your talk title is very appropriate because, as you know, we are commemorating India's independence, 75 years of independence. And so these lectures are part of the AKAM or Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav series. So without any further delay, let me hand it over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Seema. And as I was saying, it's really a pleasure and a privilege to be here today, particularly after first visiting the Centre for Women's Development Studies way back in 2011 when I first came to Delhi. I'm going to just dive right in and start with my presentation. On the 3rd of April, 2018, if you were to have gone onto the Google search engine platform, this is the Google Doodle that you would have seen. And we can turn to slide number 2. This doodle was commissioned to celebrate the 115th birthday of Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, who is described in the accompanying write-up as a freedom fighter, art enthusiast, social activist, actor, youth leader, and forward-thinking women's movement organizer. This depiction by Finland-based artist Parvati Pillai shows Kamala Devi surrounded by the many cultural objects and practices she fought to elevate and protect, including traditional instruments and traditional forms of Indian dance, as well as crafts, arts, embroidery, and basket weaving. Now, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay is well known as a patron and protector of traditional art and craft forms in India. But what is less well known is how she was able to make the connection between artistic creativity and freedom and notions of economic and political freedom. Chattopadhyay's focus on the revival of village handicrafts as a means of sustainable livelihoods illustrates the way in which she combined the Gandhian philosophy of village regeneration and self-sufficiency, her own socialist belief in cooperative development and decentralized power, and her love of traditional Indian arts and crafts. She diverged from a more traditionalist and romantic Gandhian approach to village revival, however, by being a pragmatist who realized the need to adapt crafts to make them marketable and desirable for a modern audience. And that's exactly what she tried to do. Chattopadhyay used her career in the development of rural arts and crafts
Annie, we can't hear you. Akla, I don't know what's happening.
Some internet issues at her level now.
Annie, we can't hear you. Can you just come in again, please?
Not just concerned with how the preservation of communities. I'm in my mind. Is this okay? I'm not sure.
Oh no.
There are some internet issue at her level because the net is very slow at her. Yeah, now she rejoins.
Annie, is it okay? Can you hear us? You're muted. You're muted.
We were disconnected, but I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Okay,
now.
let me carry on then. We can turn now to slide number 3. As Reena Nanda, one of Kamala Devi's more recent biographers, has put it, at the core of the artist was a socialist politician whose interaction with peasants and workers had given her an insight into poverty and the problems of rural artisans. India celebrates her 75th birthday this year. In this presentation with you today, I want to reflect on the making of India's nation state through the life of Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay and some of her colleagues in the Indian nationalist and women's movement, who, like her, were both political and social and gender justice activists. Now, there are many names to choose from, but based on my previous research, I'm going to dip into the rich lives and careers of Renuka Ray, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, and here you can also change to slide number 4, Hansa Mehta, and so just to give you a bit of an overview of these individuals' politics, worldview and philosophy. So both Gandhian and Nehruvian politics and developmental thinking provided a foundation for the gender politics and developmental praxis of this generation. A range of other ideologies and philosophies, including social feminism, Western feminism, socialism, Marxism, and various movements of international solidarity were also influential to them. The close interlinking of nationalism in the Indian context with social reform in the 19th and the early 20th centuries meant that for Ray, Chattopadhyay, Pandit, Mehta, and Sharma, they saw political autonomy and freedom from colonial subjugation as empowerment and freedom of the national movement had given them inequalities, while an involvement at a leadership level in nationalism and the opportunities to travel widely within India and even internationally. Now, these women trod in the footsteps of an earlier generation, fostered by the emergence of a thriving print culture in the form of women's magazines in Tamil, Marathi, and Bengali in the late 19th century. And this print consciousness in turn expressed a new kind of feminist consciousness in which there was energetic discussion about emancipation and modernity. So there was an older generation of female role models that this generation also looked to, individuals such as Pandita Ramabai and, of course, Annie Besant for inspiration. Gandhi's first major satyagraha campaign, the non-cooperation movement from 1920 to 1922, opened up nationalist politics in a new way for this generation. And their involvement was then deepened with the civil disobedience movement in the early 1930s and the Quit India campaign in the early 1940s. So, for example, Ray tells us in her autobiography that the watershed moment for her and for many of her generation came with the special Congress session in September 1920 in Calcutta, when Gandhiji outlined his satyagraha time, recalls how she met Gandhiji for the first time at the session, and it changed her life. Likewise, Pandit's first meeting with Gandhiji also took place at this crucial moment. She remembers being carried away and donating her jewelry to the cause after Gandhi called on volunteers to collect money to help the families of those arrested in the Satyagraha campaign. Following independence, the Nehruvian era opened up an unprecedented set of opportunities for this generation to take part in the construction of a new political and social order in India, a set of opportunities that had been unavailable to any generation previously. What held this generation together as a cohesive group at this moment was the fact that they saw themselves as agents of change. They believed they had a contribution to make to the nation-building project, and they were committed to building the principles and practices of gender equality into this project. They also had unprecedented philanthropic resources and political will, and they were able to innovate and experiment with different developmental models. While the Towards Equality report of 1974 highlighted the limitations of this generation's work to achieve broad-based social and gender justice in India, it does not undermine the significance of this work that they engaged in on its own terms, or the many lessons that can be learned from it. Now, before we carry on, I just want to make a few points about the fifth individual I've chosen to include in my discussion. Ray, Renuka Ray, Pandit, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, and Hansa Mehta are all in some senses household national names in India. Sala Sharma isn't as well known nationally, although she is a key figure. She's known within the sort of communist Indian women's movement. I felt, however, that her story and her life's work was equally, if not more relevant to the broader story of nation-making in independent India. Sala was an activist for women's uplift and empowerment. She was a communist and a founding member of the National Federation of Indian Women. And she actually only died earlier this year at the age of 100. Meeting and interviewing her in December 2011 was one of the most exciting and enriching moments of my research. After navigating my way through the maze of bustling lanes of Old Delhi, I arrived at the Sharma family Haveli for my interview. Sala was in her late 80s with a long grey plait, and she appeared small and frail. But when I showed her my questions for the interview and we started chatting, it was clear that her mind was as sharp as ever. We must have spent about 3 hours talking about her life's work and her work in the municipal government, her involvement with the Communist Party of India, and her involvement with the National Federation of Indian Women. And you can now turn to slide number 5. To thank her for her time, I shared with her the autobiography of one of South Africa's pioneering political women, Helen Suzman. Suzman was an anti-apartheid activist and politician. She had an extensive and distinguished parliamentary career of nearly 40 years, representing the United Party and later the Progressive Party in South Africa. These were white, liberal, centre-left parties that opposed the racist regime in South Africa. She was an outspoken critic of apartheid and used her parliamentary privilege to bring to international attention the human rights abuses in South Africa. This small act of exchange, the story of an Indian woman freedom fighter, a political and women's activist, for that of a pioneering South African woman parliamentarian who opposed apartheid, is a reminder of the many international and transnational exchanges and forms of solidarity engaged in by Kamala Devi and her generation. Of course, this transnational space was at times also a space of tension and marginalization and disagreement for women activists from the global South. And I will speak more about this later as well. We can now turn to slide number 6. Now, these women whose lives and careers I've chosen to share with you today were in turn embedded into national women's organizations: the All India Women's Conference, founded in 1927, and the National Federation of Indian Women, of which Shala Sharma was a founding member in 1954. These organizations had a national leadership, but extended down to the ground with local branches, which were engaged in a wide variety of welfare, developmental, social justice, and political work. And they are a reminder of the collaborative and collective nature of activism engaged in by this generation. They're also a reminder that India was and continues to be built by millions of female hands over the course of its 75 years of existence. Now, I just want to talk for a moment about using autobiography and life writing to reflect on the project of the nation state. Firstly, Ray, Chattopadhyay, and Pandit all produced their own autobiographies, and I've used them extensively in my research. They began to write and publish these in the 1970s, going through into the 1980s and into the early 1990s. Hansa Mehta did not write her own autobiography, but her work, particularly her involvement in the United Nations Human Rights Committee and the Women's Committee, has been documented in the book India and the Quest for One World, The Peacemakers, by Bhagavan, which I have used extensively. And for Hansa Mehta's story, I've also drawn on a range of secondary literature and primary sources, including Mehta's own private papers and All India Women's Conference papers at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. In the case of Shala Sharma, I've used oral history, my oral history interview, together with archival documents, particularly those that relate to the work of the National Federation of Indian Women. Now, national histories of the nation state that are associated with celebrations such as India's 75th birthday tend to present a top-down narrative, which is often masculine and tells a triumphant, chronological, and seamless story. Well, part of my objective in this presentation is to acknowledge and celebrate the innovative and important role that these women played as individuals and as part of a broader women's and social movements in the nation building project. I also want to use their life stories to challenge and to complicate this narrative. The autobiographies of Ray, Chattopadhyay, and Pandit, and the life histories of Mehta and Sharma are indeed narratives where the autobiographical subject is built around the axis of the nation, and where the political self develops in relation to a collective political consciousness. At the same time, however, a deeper analysis of these accounts reveals a more fractured and flawed autobiographical self, which humanizes these individuals and allows us to explore the complexity and the shortcomings of our national heroes and the national narrative itself. Secondly, the fact that these women were moving and working in a man's world in many respects, and here I refer both to the nationalist movement and the sphere of parliamentary politics post-independence, means that they did indeed confront discrimination and prejudice, both from individuals and from the institutions of the new nation state and its social structures. And they wrote and they spoke about these. In this respect, their accounts provide an entry point for exploring the fissures and the flaws, the contradictions and the tensions, and the failures within the nation building project. And they equally complicate the relationship between these individuals and the post-colonial state. A final point to note here is that the expansiveness required of life writing as a method and approach lends itself well to track both change and continuity across the nation building state project as well. Right, without any further ado, let me introduce you to these women. And we're going to start once again with Kamala Devi, and you can turn to slide number 7. So Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay's career moves in a circle from an early interest in the arts, particularly theatre, into nationalist politics in the 1920s, and after independence returns to its original artistic orientation through her involvement in the cooperative movement and the development of Indian handicrafts. She was born into a Saraswat Brahmin community in Mangalore in 1903, and growing up remembers her mother as a staunch nationalist who had a lot of political literature lying around the family home. Kamala Devi first entered nationalist politics in 1923 when she was invited to become a volunteer in the Seva Dal, an organization established to train satyagrahis. Shortly after this, she became involved in the Congress youth movement. Further, a nationalist activism followed with her participation in Gandhi's 1930 Salt Satyagraha, a campaign against the British monopoly on the manufacture of Indian salt. She was first married as a child bride in 1917 and widowed 2 years later. Chattopadhyay defied Hindu tradition by remarrying Harindranath Chattopadhyay of Sarojini Naidu at the age of 20. This was a love match with both young people sharing a passion for. But Chattopadhyay was unprepared to tolerate her husband's aggressive temperament. And so she defied tradition for a second time to divorce in 1933. With the divorce being a taboo in India during this period, her respectability was likely to have been tarnished by this breakup of her family life. And this could have negatively affected her career prospects in party politics. Here you can turn to the next slide, slide number 8. And I'm just checking that everyone can hear me loudly and clearly.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Right, so Chattopadhyay describes her withdrawal from political affairs as a decision prompted by the changing nature of politics. With the coming of independence, she writes, as freedom came, service was replaced by struggle for positions of power. To me, the beacon lay elsewhere in the side lanes of creative and constructive work. Reena Nanda, one of her biographers, however, argues that Chattopadhyay's political prospects in the Congress party were indeed impeded by her personal life, and that this marginalization began in 1936 when Gandhiji, concerned that her divorce made her an unsuitable role model, was influential in blocking her appointment to the executive of Congress. Post-independence, Chattopadhyay then turns to Indian handicrafts and arts, and she becomes a pioneer in the revival of village handicrafts as a means of sustainable livelihoods. In so doing, combining the Gandhian philosophy of village regeneration and self-sufficiency with her own socialist belief in cooperative development and decentralized power, and her love of traditional Indian arts and crafts. And as I mentioned before, she diverged from the Gandhian approach in having a very pragmatic strategy, which sought to make these crafts and arts marketable for a modern audience. Her career therefore provides not only an interesting case study of the way in which this generation of women interpreted, developed, and implemented Gandhian philosophy, but also how they challenged conventional boundaries of the political. Apart from her contribution to Indian handicrafts, Kamala Devi also helped set up the Indian National Theatre, which is today known as the National School of Drama. And she wrote and published extensively too, books on Indian crafts and art forms, on her travel to the United States during World War II, and on the status of Indian women. Her autobiography was first published in 1982, and she died in 1988. And you can now turn to slide number 9. Okay. So Vijay Lakshmi Pandit's political consciousness developed in her affluent family home in Allahabad, where prominent nationalist characters were often invited to socialize. A key moment of political awakening occurred for her in 1916, when her aunt, Rameshwari Nehru, took her to attend a women's meeting which she had organized to publicize the issue of the discrimination faced by Indians in South Africa. In her autobiography, Pandit recalls that at the time, she did not understand the broader significance of these events, but this experience of being part of this meeting gave her a feeling of participation in the cause and was followed by her attendance at the 1916 Indian National Congress in Lucknow. Pandit joined the Congress and was involved in the anti-colonial campaigns of the 20s, 30s, and 40s. She also led the first Indian delegation to the United Nations in 1946, and you can see her there at the UN in that image. And this was a task which opened up the door for a successful career as a diplomat. Between 1946 and 1962, she became an established figure on the international stage, serving as Indian ambassador to the Soviet Russia, the United States, Mexico, England, Ireland, and Spain. And she also headed several Indian delegations to the United Nations. And in 1953, she was elected the first woman president of the United Nations General Assembly. She returns to politics back at home in 1962 as governor of Maharashtra and a member of parliament then and in the 1960s. Now, moving and thriving in what was at that time a highly masculine world, Pandit's career as an international diplomat offered her the opportunity to challenge gender stereotypes. She confesses how she enjoyed the ongoing surprise she created at the 1946 UN session, where many people struggled to reconcile her presence with their firmly established view of an Indian woman, and she describes this as such: a clinging vine subservient to all manner of caste restrictions. During her time as leader of the Indian delegation at the United Nations, and later in 1953 as its president, Pandit captured the world's imagination by drawing on the symbolic power that Indian women represented in the public sphere to promote the principles at the heart of India's foreign policy, such as independence for colonial territories in Asia and Africa. And also as an empowered woman who was able to engage with the world's political players on her own terms, she conveyed India as a new nation state grounded on the principles of equality, freedom, and empowerment. And I'm going to turn more a bit later to Pandit's experiences at the UN. We can now move on to the next slide as well, slide number 10. The next woman I've chosen to focus on is Renuka Ray. Renuka Ray was born in 1904 and recalls growing up with nationalist slogans such as Bande Mataram and Swadeshi, and the longing for the liberty of her country in her middle-class Bengali home in Kolkata. After committing herself passionately to the national struggle as a teenager, she was sent by her father to study economics at the London School of Economics in London in the early 1920s. In her autobiography, she describes this as a cosmopolitan and enriching time, and a vibrant experience which opened many doors and exposed her to many new schools of thought. It was during this time that she began to think about how to achieve economic regeneration for India. Now, Emma Bong Emoren's recently published book, Race Women Internationalists, Activist Intellectuals and Global Freedom Struggles, explores how the experience of travel for Caribbean and African American women in the early and mid-1920th century provided a space and a staging ground from which to experience, analyze, and challenge their own positions of gendered and racial subjugation. And I think a very similar thing can be said for the experience of these Indian women as well. And this is clearly illustrated by a kind of Ray's experience at LSE, although this was a more positive experience where it brought her exposure to new ideas around development. The more positive aspect of this international positioning and exposure is also illustrated by the experience of Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, who describes visiting cooperative farms in Sweden in her autobiography, and how this exposure opened up new vistas for cooperative work in India. Travel also helped this generation to build links with the international women's movement, which were very strategic. They fostered solidarity and inspiration, but equally also at times resistance and differentiation, as third world women experienced the race and the class blindness of their Western counterparts. They offered valuable lessons about the power of collaboration and the strategic use of international perceptions in nationalist politics. But they equally exposed the need for the development of a position from which Indian women and their colleagues from other colonial nations could speak, both as women and as former colonial subjects. Now, returning to the story of Renuka Ray. After returning from London back to India, she married Satyan Ray, a civil servant whose job postings in rural India brought her into contact with village life and its problems. In the 1930s, she was able to apply this experience to the nationalist cause when Gandhiji asked her to volunteer in his village reconstruction program, after which her career in social and constructive work took off. She continued to pursue her commitment to women's rights, rehabilitation, and welfare after independence as a member of parliament and as a cabinet minister in West Bengal. Renuka was the first woman to hold a state cabinet post as Minister of Relief and Rehabilitation in West Bengal from 1952 to 1957, and was a long-standing member of parliament from the late 40s into the 50s and into the late 1960s, during which time she was an outspoken advocate for the reform of social laws relating to women. And she also held strategic influence within the Congress Party as a member of its executive committee, and she was a governmental advisor on welfare subjects and policy. Now, in this position, Ray tells us that since the time of Mahatma Gandhi, I had always been able to express my viewpoint, even when I differed with the party, and sometimes I won my point also. This becomes one of the defining features of her political personality in post-independence, where her vocal criticism of Congress policy at times, at certain times, enabled her to maintain a sense of autonomy and a sense of herself as a distinct political figure, rather than merely being defined as a Congress politician. So, for example, in her autobiography, she describes how she was part of a small minority who opposed Nehru and Congress over the degree of protection accorded to private property in the Indian Constitution. Ray was chosen by this group to move their proposed amendment calling for changes to the property rights clause. And she actually even appendixes an extract from the speech she made in support of this in her autobiography. This outspokenness surfaces again in her parliamentary career when she joined the Socialist Study Group in Parliament, which she writes did not endear me to the party bosses, who had felt she had moved too far to the left. But I think these examples are very important because they show that these important political women cannot be merely viewed as appendages of the Congress Party, that they actually need to be seen as having their own independent politics and at times speaking out against Congress politics and policy. Right, moving on to our next individual, Hansa Mehta, and you can change to slide number 11 now. Hansa Mehta was born into an educated, affluent family living in the Baroda state in Gujarat in 1897. She graduated in India with a degree in philosophy in 1918, and then, like Ray, she went to study at the London School of Economics, where she completed a degree in journalism and sociology. She entered public life in the mid-1920s when she joined the Bombay branch of the All India Women's Conference, later moving up into the organization's leadership and becoming its president in the mid-1940s. There she pioneered the All India Women Conference's Indian Women's Charter of Rights and Duties, which I'll talk more about later. She played a leadership role in the Congress Party and became a member of the Constituent Assembly, helping to draft the new constitution, while also representing India at the United Nations. After this, she moved on to play an important role in education in India, becoming Vice Chancellor of Baroda University, a position she held from 1949 to 58. Like Kamala Devi, she was also a writer, producing children's books and translating English works, including Shakespeare's plays, into Gujarati. She died in 1995. And you can now move to slide number 12. Sala Sharma was born in the 1920s into a progressive Delhi family involved in girls' education and became a student activist for the national cause as a teenager. Exposure to Marxism through her peers led her to join the Communist Party-affiliated All India Students' Federation in 1936 and the Communist Party of India 3 years later. She also joined the Gandhian struggle for independence in the 1930s. Sharma was a member of the All India Women's Conference in Delhi, but she found herself frustrated in the 1940s by what she perceived as a neglect of working women's needs and struggles within the organization. This frustration drew her to the National Federation of Indian Women, of which she was a founding member. And this was an ongoing association she had with the Federation for the rest of her life. I was very lucky to be loaned by Sharla an original copy of the conference report from the very first session of the National Federation of Indian Women. And later on in my PowerPoints, I will show you this conference report. Now, Sala combined her leadership role with the National Federation of Indian Women with work as a local councillor for the Communist Party of India in Delhi. And she was, in fact, a founding member of the Communist Party of India, Delhi state. In our modern day and age, it's easy to forget how brave and radical in some senses it was for these young women to choose to engage politically. This was a choice that could create a struggle between loyalty to family and middle-class respectability versus commitment to alternative social ideals and political aspirations. In many families, when children joined revolutionary movements, they were kicked out, Sala remembers. Sala recalls a period in her early political life where she encountered such a struggle and was forced to choose between her political commitment and her health and family. She was working underground for the Communist Party of India at the time, carrying information when she was involved in an accident on her bicycle and her leg was severely damaged. She had to be admitted to hospital, but because she was working underground, the doctor had to hide her away in a storeroom rather than admit her officially, and she couldn't tell anyone where she was. It was here that she spent many lonely and painful months recovering. This was a time of great personal struggle for her, one filled with extreme pain as well as isolation and loneliness, as being in hiding meant that her friends and her family couldn't come and visit her. After more than a year in a hospital, she was sent home with a diagnosis that she would never be able to use her leg again. And you can change to slide number 13 now. During this time, Sala read the autobiography of World War II Russian fighter pilot Alexei Marsiev, who had lost both legs when his plane crashed. Refusing to give up, he embarked on a long process of rehabilitation, and after much perseverance, he learned to fly with prosthetic legs and returned to action. It's not surprising that Sala, as a young communist, would have turned to a Soviet hero at this moment. Encouraged by this story, Sala decided to employ a practitioner of Ayurvedic massage to come and live in her household and to give her daily treatments. After several months of circulation and feeling in her leg improved, and she was able to use her leg again. Overcoming the physical impairment of her injury acts almost as a rite of passage in her account, shaping how she sees herself in the world as a fighter and a survivor. Her personal struggle over pain, loneliness, and disability become closely interwoven with her commitment to her political struggle for social justice and gender equality through Marxism. Right, now I've gone on to introduce these women, and I realize I've got limited time left, but with the time left to me, I want to now touch on a few key moments and processes that these women were involved in. Now, this generation of women contributed to the nation building project while simultaneously standing at moments in tension or contradiction with it. And they equally tried to expand its meaning and its application. And this is clearly illustrated in some of the moments or processes which I wish to discuss with you now. And the first is the famous 1930 salt satyagraha. And here you can turn to slide 14. Okay, right. And I also, in talking about the satyagraha, I return to the story of Kamala Devi. So it was at its 1929 Lahore session that Congress agreed that its goal was Purna Swaraj, or complete independence, and that this was to be achieved through civil disobedience rather than discussion and collaboration with the British Raj. In alignment with this, Congress embarked at the beginning of 1930 on the first phase of its 1930 to 34 civil disobedience campaign. This campaign was to commence with the Salt Satyagraha, a protest against the British imposition of taxes on Indian manufactured salt. Gandhi's famous salt march through Gujarat to the coastal village of Dundee started off this satyagraha, and this took place in March and April 1930. And it kicked off proceedings and was followed by groups of volunteers across the country, breaking the salt laws, picketing legislatures, and boycotting alcohol and imported cloth. Kamala Devi participated in the Salt Satyagraha, which launched this first phase of the civil disobedience campaign, defiantly auctioning salt in markets and even the local courthouse in violation of the British monopoly. In her autobiography, she describes the mass participation of women in the campaign and the sense of agency, solidarity, and collective action that this experience fostered in her consciousness. Here you can turn to slide 15. This is how she describes it. The whole air became so surcharged. Every nerve in the body tingled. I felt elated as part of one of the most spectacular dramas in India's political history. In setting the scene, she writes that although India had a long, illustrious tradition of women warriors, the Salt Satyagraha marked their first appearance in any modern militant political campaign. She goes on to recall that while signing her name on the campaign pledge, it seemed such a stupendous moment in my life, in the life of the women of my country. I felt I was tracing not the letters of my name, but recording a historic event. Now, the Salt Satyagraha might well have turned out differently had it not been for the persistence of energetic young activists such as Kamala Devi, as Gandhi's initial vision for the Satyagraha did not include a direct role for women. Gandhian nationalism is often presented as a movement that facilitated the entry of Indian women into nationalist politics en masse. But I think, as this example, which I'm going to describe to you now, explains, often it was young women themselves that had to fight and push for their own inclusion. So in her autobiography, Kamala Devi describes her excitement on hearing about the Salt Satyagraha, followed by her disappointment on being told that she could not participate. As batches for the first Satyagraha were to be selected, I asked that women be included. I was told that Gandhiji did not want them, as he had other programs reserved for them. I was flabbergasted, she writes. She decided to travel to Surat specifically to visit Gandhi and to persuade him to change his mind. When she confronted Gandhi over his exclusion of women in the Satyagraha, he reassured her that his decision was not based on discrimination, but rather due to the fact that he had reserved specific and alternative activities for them, including the promotion of Swadeshi, the picketing of foreign goods, and the elimination of liquor, which he felt were more suitable to their nature. He said the call for them was not for slogan shouting or marches, but utter dedication, which was the natural quality of women. Now, Chattopadhyay did not, she very cleverly, she didn't challenge Gandhi's logic that women were endowed with specific feminine qualities. In fact, she very cleverly made a counter argument using this logic, but turning it back on itself. She argued that it was the unique nature of satyagraha as a form of moral protest that enabled it to accommodate women as the weaker sex. And she wrote, the significance of nonviolent struggle is that the weakest can take part on equal terms with the strongest and share in the triumph, as you yourself had said. And as the mass participation of Indian women in the march indicates, Kamala Devi clearly won out in this debate. And now, Kamala Devi's description of this set of events leading up to the Salt Satyagraha suggests that the new opportunities created by women's participation in the struggle for independence were not simply facilitated by Gandhian nationalism, but that they were equally a product of individual and collective efforts to push, challenge, and expand the openings that Gandhian nationalism created. Now, I want to turn to the next moment, a significant moment. And here it's really Vijay Lakshmi Pandit who comes to the center stage. Now, much of the literature and theorizing around powerful political women leaders in Southeast Asia has sought to understand their rise and success in relation to their dynastic or family connections. This has certainly come into play in the case of Indira Gandhi, daughter of India's first Prime Minister Nehru, and also Benazir Bhutto, Prime Minister of Pakistan, and Khalida Zia, the first female Prime Minister of Bangladesh. As a member of the famous Nehru family and the sister of India's first independent Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, this was always a shadow hanging over the head of Vijay Lakshmi Pandit. How to forge a career to define oneself in one's own terms, not by one's family. And it's in the sphere of diplomacy that Vijay Lakshmi Pandit finds the space and the scope to do so. Although Pandit held high-ranking representative positions as part of the Congress movement, both before and after independence, reflecting on her public career in her autobiography, she describes herself as belonging to the world of international diplomacy rather than that of contemporary politics. On her ambassadorial career, she comments, "I have always felt equally at home in both worlds, West and East." In contrast, she describes herself as being out of place in the political field after independence, stating, "I'm not a politician. The ways of modern politics are not my meter." Pandit's identification as a diplomat by nature enables her to create a subject position for herself in her autobiography, which distinguishes her contribution to nation building from that of her family's role within the sphere of nationalist politics. And Pandit's career is launched at the end of 1946, when representing India at the United Nations, she is able to successfully get a resolution condemning discrimination against Indians in South Africa passed through the United Nations committees. And here you can turn to slide number 16. So earlier that year, in 1946, the Union Government of South Africa had passed the Asiatic Land Tenure and Indian Representation Act. This relegated Indians in the province of Natal to second-class citizens by restricting their franchise through educational and property qualifications and by legalizing segregated residential areas. And the Natal Indian Congress actually organized a satyagraha in protest against this in 1946. And in this image you can actually see the first group of passive resistors who took part in this campaign in South Africa. Now, Pandit had been asked to lead India's delegation to the United Nations, and Gandhiji tasked her with ensuring that this issue was inscribed on the United Nations agenda. In putting forward her case, Pandit argued that the Union of South Africa was a member state of the United Nations and a signatory of its charter, and could therefore not get away with what she called such a gross and continuing outrage to its fundamental principles. Claiming equal and honorable treatment for our people wherever they may go, she emphasized that the South African issue had global significance because of the interconnectedness of freedom and rights as laid out in the Charter. Now, a formidable debate ensued between Vijay Lakshmi Pandit and Field Marshal General Smuts around this issue. And this debate revolved around the boundaries of domestic jurisdiction versus global governance, with South Africa defending their position on the basis that this was a matter of domestic jurisdiction. The Indian delegation, in turn, based their argument on a universal understanding of human rights, claiming that such rights were to be guaranteed for all by the United Nations on the basis of being human, rather than on the basis of being citizens of nation states or subjects of empires. They argued that the racial prejudice underpinning the Asiatic Land Tenure and Indian Representation Act violated the dignity and self-respect of all Indians and threatened peace, a priority at the heart of the new organization. In December of that year, after the Indian motion had been voted through the committees, India achieved a 2/3 vote for this resolution in the General Assembly, asking South Africa to undertake negotiations with India and Pakistan for a better deal for the citizens in those countries. While the resolution unfortunately had little impact on the policies of the South African government, with the Nationalist Party being voted into power 2 years later in 1948 and then implementing apartheid, it did place the issue of racial discrimination on the agenda, allowing it to be continually raised and condemned in the 1950s and the 60s at the United Nations by India and by other African countries. In so doing, Pandit set a precedent for all colonized people, ensuring that violations of their rights would no longer be accepted silently. In her autobiography, she describes the success as an Asian victory. It was not only a personal or even a national triumph, but it became a symbol of the right to freedom for all Asian peoples around the world. Right, now I know that I am quite close to running out of time. I think I have about 7 minutes left. I just want to see if I need to maybe skip a bit and amend to go closer to the end of my talk. So I just want to confirm I've got the time. I should be stopping at 7 minutes from now, but I'm not sure if I need to conclude a bit sooner.
Annie, you can take 10 minutes, no issue.
Okay, all right. I will make sure I'm finished before then. Okay. So the next moment that I want to touch on also takes place in 1946. And this is the drafting of the mandate of the United Nations Committee on the Status of Women. And here it is Hansa Mehta who is the central figure in this story. So we can now turn to slide number 18. Right, so, oh yes, I think that's slide 17 and one more. Great, okay, so it's the beginning of 1946 and Mehta has been asked to head the representation of India's provincial government at the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, which was constituted in February 1946. Responding to being asked to lead this task, she wrote, "It's a great honor that an Indian woman will have a say in the future of the women of the world. women have played a great part during the world crisis, meaning World War II, and it is but in the fitness of things that they should demand to have a place in the world of the future, she wrote. And you can now turn to slide 19. The Commission on Human Rights was responsible for drafting a Universal Declaration of Human Rights and an International Bill of Rights, providing a definition for these terms or concepts that could be written into law. Along with the formation of the Committee on Human Rights, another grouping of delegates and experts, known as the Subcommittee on the Status of Women, was formed alongside and placed under the CHR. In June 1946, this subcommittee was then elevated to the status of an independent commission. Now, the Committee on the Status of Women was tasked with applying the principles of human rights, and here you can move to slide number 20, which were to be defined by the Committee on Human Rights to the position of women in society by making recommendations on the legislative and policy actions to achieve these. Hansa Mehta, in fact, initially sat on the Committee on the Status of Women. And in this image here, you can see her on the far left, together with on the Committee on the Status of Women before being designated to the Commission on Human Rights. But as a delegate with a specific interest in gender equality issues, she continued to follow the Committee on the Status of Women's work once she was appointed to the CHR. And she continued to give input and feedback to the Committee on the Status of Women. And in fact, although she leaves the Committee on the Status of Women, there are also two fellow All India Women's Conference organizers, Sharifa Hamid Ali and Hannah Sen, who are also part of this committee. And so there's a continual input and exchange with Indian women giving their input into shaping this committee. Now, when Hansa was called to represent India at the Human Rights Commission, she was also involved in the work of the All India Women's Conference, and in fact was completing a term as the organization's president. With negotiations for independence and the formation of a provisional national and provisional governments well underway, and the writing of the Indian Constitution about to commence, this was a crucial moment for the All India Women's Conference to ensure that the meaning of women's equality was adequately articulated and guaranteed, and that representatives of the women's movement were able to participate fully in this process of nation building. Although the nationalist movement supported women's equality in theory, the conference realized that translating this abstract principle into substantial equality would be a challenge. It would require a clear spelling out of the meaning and implications of such equality and active lobbying on the part of the women's movement. And here you can turn to slide 21. So the executive body of the All India Women's Conference, which at this stage also included Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, Hansa Mehta, Lakshmi Menon, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, Renuka Ray, Kitty Shiva Rao, and Hannah Sen, therefore conceptualized and drew up an Indian Women's Charter of Rights and Duties and its accompanying twin, a Memorandum on Planning for National Welfare in 1945 at their annual conference. These documents laid out women's political rights as well as their demand for equality in the place of work. And they also addressed women's position in their family, called for the reform of personal law, and acknowledged the value of Indian women's unpaid labor. Rights were in turn balanced with duties. Now, these documents were voted upon and published a year later in June 1946 in the All India Women's Conference's journal Roshni. And Meta took a copy of this charter then to Lake Success, where she was meeting with the Human Rights Commission in May 1946. And when the subcommittee on the status of women found itself struggling to define its own mandate, as well as the meaning and implications of women's equality at both national and international levels, she offered this charter as a guideline. A comparison of the wording of the principles of the subcommittee with the preamble of the All India Women's Charter suggests the significant role the Charter played in shaping the subcommittee's mandate. Coverage of the session in the New York Herald Tribune described the event with the following headline: "Women of the UN unite in vote of full equality. Mrs. Roosevelt is leader at second sessions. India's formula wins support." And you can now turn to slide 22, and I'm going to conclude shortly. So in fact, the first 3 paragraphs of the subcommittee's resolution were taken word for word from the Indian Women's Charter of Rights and Duties. And you can see this wording over here. In other words, the All India Women Conference's Indian Women's Charter of Rights and Duties was being used as a policy document to lobby for equal rights within India, within the Constituent Assembly over the same period that it was being integrated into the Committee on the Status of Women's Principles and Mandate. The movement of the Charter from the Indian context into the United Nations encourages a rethinking of human rights as a Western-centric concept. It provides a concrete example of the impact of ideas and lived experience from the margins in the development of the history of human rights. Now, I know my time is nearly up, so I am going to conclude. There were a few more moments I wanted to talk about, but I think we don't have time. The formation of the National Federation of Indian Women, and also look at the passing of the Hindu Code Bills. And then I was going to talk briefly about international solidarity and friendship. And perhaps just on this point, we can move forward to the next slide. This is the cover of the report from the first conference of the National Federation of Indian Women, formed in 1954. This was an original document I received from Sala Sharma. And then if we can just move one more slide over, and one more. And then I just wanted to talk a bit about the way in which the formation of South Africa's Federation of South African Women, also in 1954, garners support from Indian women as well, to show another example of this transnational solidarity. And moving one more slide over. So there was some really nice messages from the Federation of South African Women, and they included messages of support from the Women's International Democratic Federation. This was the federation that the National Federation of Indian Women fell under, and a special message of support from Vijay Lakshmi Pandit. So a reminder, of course, that this cohort of women weren't just involved in building the Indian nation state, but they were also involved in building a kind of transnational movement of gender activism and solidarity. And I think on that note, I know I've gone a bit over time, but I will end my presentation.
Thank you, Annie. And I think that was quite a very interesting presentation. And I think that we will now have a question and answer session. So I hand it over to my colleague, Bhashwati. Bhashwati, please take it.
Thank you, Annie, for the presentation. Now, if any question,
Just unmute yourself, Ashwati. I think you're...
Nita wants to speak.
Yeah, Vasanti, you have a question.
No, I was just pointing out that Nita had put up her hand.
You are muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Bashati, kindly unmute.
Can you unmute yourself, Ashwati?
Bashati, please unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
Yes. Anyway, let's invite the question. So in the meantime,
Yes.
Ashwati can also come in. Ashwati, can you hear us now?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Nita wants to speak.
Yes, sir. No,
Nita, ma'am.
Vasanti, I haven't put my hand. Sorry.
Sorry, I thought you had.
No, thanks.
Well, I had a comment and question, Ashwati.
Please go ahead.
Annie, thank you for your presentation. And thank you also for some of the documentation, which was quite vivid and rich. I think what you've done is you've captured a moment in time, when just after independence, where the project of women's equality, women's liberation was in sync with the nationalist project, and I wonder what your thoughts might be at this point of time when the compact, which was there which was, you have evidence also of the compact and some of the documents which you shared. I mean, that compact no longer exists. And you perhaps might be aware of that very much in India. So I wonder if you had some thoughts about that, because that now does seem a very long time ago, and it was a very rich period. But the present moment is a moment in time when, well, there has been a lot of criticism by various women's groups, the women's movement, and indeed maybe a certain sense of disappointment, if not hostility, to the state. So I wonder if you had any thoughts about that.
I don't know if there are any other questions, if I should sort of take a group together and then respond, or if there aren't, then I can perhaps just respond to this one.
Yeah, you can respond.
Okay. Yes, Seema, absolutely. And I think that sometimes there is a tendency then to look back on this period and also to, I suppose, kind of critique this generation for kind of failing. They weren't obviously just working towards and advocating for gender justice, but of course this was a generation that was trying to achieve a kind of a broad-based equality for ordinary Indian citizens on the ground. Certainly, again, by focusing on this particular kind of cohort, I know one also opens oneself up to criticism to say that they were elitist. They didn't represent Dalit women, or they didn't necessarily, they weren't very inclusive. But I think that somehow, I think you have to acknowledge their contribution on its own terms, without necessarily simply sort of labeling it a failure, because it, a kind of the nation state hasn't developed along the sort of lines or the vision that that they had in mind. I guess the challenges that India has faced, both sort of political and developmental, have been quite formidable. I guess today as well, India certainly does have a strong women's movement, but it's partly connected to and embedded within, I suppose, a larger movement around gender diversity and LGBTQI rights. There are other struggles, of course, that women participate actively, including sort of social movements, issues around community control over resources, preventing the state taking over land, water, etc., etc. So in some respects, I guess if we look at things today, we need to look more at notions of sort of the embeddedness of women in social movements, environmental struggles, and their role in broader sort of gender justice and gender diversity movements and campaigns.
Any question? Any other question, comments? Yes, ma'am, please. Unmute yourself, ma'am.
I think take Indu first. She's just put her hand.
Okay, okay. Indu ma'am, please unmute yourself. Ma'am, unmute yourself.
Okay, well, I thought, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Okay, thank you. A big thank you to the speaker for speaking about this period, firstly, because I think there are 2 points that I would like to cull out from the presentation that has been made. 2-3 points. One is that it highlights a period which is very critical in India's history and where women intervened very, very specifically, both as women as well as sort of political citizens asserting a citizenship within the larger freedom struggle. So I think that is very important. And there may be issues which were not sorted out. I mean, they were not sorted out for the country as a whole. And it would be premature for us to think that the women could have sorted it out themselves. On the other hand, what we do find is that I think the speaker has highlighted the international connections between the women's movement and activists' contributions at the international fora. But equally within the Indian context, these women were intervening in very, very specific ways, apart from the salt satyagraha, etc. You mentioned the Lahore Congress, and Kamala Devi writes in great detail about her role in that Congress, the session where the whole agenda of Purn Swaraj, full independence, complete independence, is taken up in a very, very big way. This is post the execution of Bhagat Singh and his comrades, and there is a huge ferment and in the youth. And Kamala Devi is, in a sense, mediating between the youth and the Congress leadership, which is resisting the pressure which is coming from below. And she writes at great length about it. And I think we need to understand and be sensitive to the contribution that these women were playing despite all the social handicaps that they were and the prejudices that they were being faced with. So that is one aspect. The other thing that I would like to say is that even post-independence, if you look at it, you hinted at Kamala Devi's sort of withdrawal, also Renuka Ray's. Now that itself is an admission as well as an articulation of an unhappiness, a dissatisfaction with the way things are going in post-independence India. Kamala Devi, for instance, in her autobiography, which you have cited, and it is well known that she came from the Congress Socialist Party stream also. And the CSP and the Socialist Party themselves are in sort of doldrums from the 50s, 60s onwards. And she expresses that sort of concern and saying that, look, I mean, so that option to move out of the more direct political scenario is also asserting a dissatisfaction with the way those events are unfolding, the way policies post-independence are unfolding. The one other point which I thought which you could have highlighted more, which may address some of Seema's concerns, although obviously those concerns cannot be fully addressed because historically that has not happened. The women you have picked on, apart from Kamala Devi, they were all in the Constituent Assembly, and they played a role in the making of the Constitution and very specific contributions on the points where they intervened. But two other women who were in the Constituent Assembly, maybe we need to sort of draw those into your presentation. One is the Chayani Velayudhan, who is the only Dalit woman member of the Constituent Assembly, and she's just 32 years old at that time. The other is Begum Ejaz Rasool, who takes a very bold stand at the time. I mean, she has her links with the Muslim League. The Muslim League boycotts the Constituent Assembly, but Ejaz Rasool asserts herself, continues to be active both in the Constituent Assembly and later in politics. And I think we need to bring out the fact that for a women's movement which was still in its very early stages and up against a colonial regime, up against a nationalist organization which was trying to go much more the bourgeois way, much more directly articulate bourgeois standpoint and demands in terms of its charters. These women, including women like Sarla Sharma, who, has an amazing life. You talked about the underground days when she's badly injured. And yet in the election, she gets the highest votes. The first election in Delhi, local elections, Sarla Sharma gets the highest votes in Delhi. So, I think we could be bring in much more into this, because I think that phase of the movement has enriched not only India's history, but also it sort of sets a challenge for the women's movement in terms of its ability to articulate the political aspirations, the aspirations for citizenship. I'm not saying that it's about competing with an earlier generation. Why I'm saying it is very often we feel that our generation is raising these concerns which were not raised earlier. And we end up often reinventing the wheel, but there's a lot to learn from that generation. So thank you very much for this
thank you for
presentation
those
and discussion.
Wonderful, those very insightful and helpful comments and input.
Vasanthi ma'am, if you have any question.
Thank you, Annie, for really a wonderful and, all-encompassing kind of narrative of this period. And there's a lot of rich detail, and it was, I think for many of us, the fact that we are going through this period, I can say for myself, and I'm sure I share the concerns of many others now, the importance of the women's participation in the national movement and the women's participation in overall political and social kind of assertion as a whole has become much more important in today's times, when there was a period, say in the 70s, 80s, when many of us felt that, yes, I think that the next generation will now have to go far ahead. But given the kind of challenges that we are now facing, the critical issues that were raised both by the national movement and the women's movement, the diversity, the heterogeneity and everything, overall addresses some central issues which we now need to go back to and to study more carefully in order to be able to face the present day challenges that we are now faced with, where more and more you find the national movement and the women's question are really so closely interlinked in many ways, and yet it has its specificities. So overall, I would like to say that your presentation helped one really look back. It kind of helps us in the process of how do we look back now, and how much there is so much more to get out of that whole period. And perhaps we need to do much more detailed studies of the women's participation in this whole process and their attempts to link up with the national movement and the overall nationalist project. Thank you so much for a good presentation.
Any other question? Annie, would you like to respond?
Yes, I mean, just to say, really, I think that I've got a lot. It's so helpful to share your research with other people, because it felt in a way that I had sort of come to the end point, that I'd been able to document the contribution of this group of women, but it has left a lot of questions and a lot of issues unresolved. And I think kind of some of these points and suggestions that have been made from the audience are really helpful in terms of thinking how I could take some of this work further.
Any other questions? So thank you, Annie, for your presentation. Thanks a lot for the audience to participate in this webinar virtually. We will see you again in another webinar. Until then, thank you.
May I request all the participants to just switch on the video mode on so that I can take a screenshot of it.
Thank you, Annie, for your presentation.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thanks to the Center for Women's Development Studies.
May I request Induji also to just on the video mode on. Thank you.
Thank you,
so
Annie.
much.
And thanks
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Were you saying something, Annie?
Oh no, I was just saying goodbye.
Okay, bye.
Bye.